October 24, 1942, began under a low, heavy sky that seemed to press down on Henderson Field, and the men ordered to keep it alive. The airstrip sat carved into Guadalcanal's rough, uneven spine, a strip of coral and clay scratched out of jungle that had no interest in giving anything up easily. Aircraft sat in their revetments like weary predators, their aluminum skins stained by exhaust and salt air, while ground crews moved around them with practiced urgency, aware that each plane able to take off meant pressure on Japanese convoys threading their way through the Solomon Sea. The Marines on the perimeter understood this in simple, hard terms. If Henderson Field fell, everything they had endured on this island would collapse with it, and the Pacific would tilt back toward the enemy. That knowledge sat in their stomachs more heavily than the rationed food they forced down before moving to their positions. The island smelled of wet earth, aviation fuel, and sweat, a mixture that had become so constant it hardly registered anymore. Along a narrow corridor leading toward the airstrip, where the terrain opened just enough to allow a determined force to push through, Sergeant John Basilone walked the line of his two heavy machine gun sections with the deliberate calm of a man who understood both his responsibility and his limits. He had fewer than 30 men to hold a stretch of ground that any map would mark as a natural approach to Henderson Field, and he knew the Japanese staff officers on the other side of the island could read maps too. The machine guns under his command were Browning water-cooled .30 calibers, solid, dependable weapons whose steel jackets and chattering bolts had already earned their place in the Marines' trust on other fields. Each gun sat in a dug-in pit, sandbags stacked as high as the earth and the collapsing material allowed, belts of ammunition coiled nearby like dull brass snakes waiting to be fed into hungry receivers. This is just one chapter of a much larger war. Subscribe to World War II Frontlines so you don't miss the next one. The soil these pits were carved from was volcanic, dark and fine, and under the day's building humidity it clung to skin and cloth, working into everything like a second, unwelcome layer. As afternoon wore on, the air thickened and the sky dimmed slightly, even though the sun still rode somewhere beyond the clouds shrouding the island's central spine. For 3 months, the fighting on Guadalcanal had been a cycle of sudden, sharp violence and long stretches of tense, grinding anticipation. Men who had come ashore in August with faces softened by youth carried themselves differently now, their movements more economical, their voices quieter, their eyes scanning the tree lines in restless patterns. Rumors about Japanese reinforcements had become part of the daily background noise. Another convoy spotted by aircraft, more ships slipping in at night under the cover of what the Marines had come to call the Tokyo Express. With every new report, the sense grew that the enemy was gathering for something decisive, and intelligence officers began to speak with more certainty about a large-scale offensive aimed directly at the perimeter near Henderson. Basilone heard those assessments in fragments, but he did not need formal briefings to understand what they meant. The enemy would come, and they would come hard. Rain began as a fine mist, and then settled into a steady fall that worked its way into everything: the gun pits, the seams of boots, the collars of already damp uniforms. The volcanic soil, which had been firm enough earlier in the day, softened under the constant weight of water and the traffic of men. Each step in the pits produced a soft, sucking sound as mud tried to hold onto boots a fraction of a second longer than it should. Basilone watched his men dig deeper, shaping firing steps, reinforcing parapets with whatever materials they had. Sandbags that leaked their contents, planks scavenged from crates, broken pieces of ammunition boxes. The act of digging did more than fortify positions. It gave restless hands and minds something concrete to work on, a way to push back against the knowledge that, beyond the perimeter, an enemy they could not see was likely doing its own form of preparation. Basilone moved among them, checking barrel spares, confirming that ammunition was protected under ponchos and oilcloth. reminding gunners to keep water jackets topped and tripods firmly bedded in the wet earth so the guns would not shift under sustained fire. As the light faded, day transitioning toward the sudden tropical darkness that came with almost no warning this close to the equator, Henderson Field adjusted its rhythm. Engines that had been running earlier wound down. Ground crews worked more quietly, their shouts dampened by the rain and the growing sense that the island was holding its breath. The perimeter, by contrast, felt more alive in the gathering gloom. Men checked rifles, pistols, and grenades with small, methodical movements. Some spoke in low tones, trading small jokes or fragments of memory from home that surfaced without invitation. Others sat silent, backs against the slick earth of their pits, eyes narrowed toward the jungle as if they could force it to reveal its secrets through will alone. Baz alone took in these details without comment. He knew fear was present in each man, manifesting as nervous chatter in one, as rigid quiet in another. He did not try to talk them out of it. Instead, he anchored them in specifics: fields of fire, overlapping arcs, the location of the nearest corpsman, the planned fallback points if any section was breached. Practical knowledge was a kind of armor, and he handed it out where he could. Night came down in a single, decisive gesture, the clouds and the rain swallowing the last light until the world beyond arm's reach became an indistinct mass of black. Henderson dimmed its visible presence, the airstrip receding into a deeper darkness to avoid drawing enemy artillery. Out along the corridor, the jungle disappeared entirely from view, replaced by an impression of shifting shadow and sound. Insects called in erratic patterns, leaves rustled under the touch of wind and water, and somewhere beyond the range of hearing, men were almost certainly moving into position with their own weapons, their own maps, their own anxieties. The Marines could not see them, but they felt their existence like a pressure just beyond the wire. Baz alone settled into his chosen position, a place from which he could move quickly to either section and listen to the rain beat its steady rhythm on helmets and steel. On maps in distant headquarters, the defense of Henderson Field looked like lines and symbols. Here, in the mud and darkness of the perimeter, it was a handful of men behind their guns, waiting for the moment when the quiet world in front of them would suddenly, violently, come alive. Just after midnight, the rain stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like cover. A thick curtain pulled across Guadalcanal so the world shrank to whatever a man could hear, and whatever a muzzle flash could briefly reveal. Out along the perimeter, other sectors were already taking scattered pressure. Distant bursts of mortar fire and the dull, wandering thump of artillery that seemed to test the line rather than break it. Diversionary blows meant to pull attention sideways, while the main force moved into place. In Baz alone's corridor, the darkness held steady until it didn't, until the jungle ahead seemed to exhale and the first shapes detached themselves from the tree line. A few rifle shots cracked like snapped boards, then more. Then the sound thickened into a rolling, uneven roar as Japanese infantry surged forward in coordinated waves, using the storm and the confusion along the perimeter to mask their approach. The Marines in the gun pits could not count them. They could only feel the mass of bodies coming through the rain, boots sliding in mud, voices rising in sharp, urgent shouts that cut through the hiss of water on leaves. The corridor toward Henderson Field, the one place where the ground opened enough for men to move fast, became a funnel, and the enemy threw itself into it. Baz alone's machine guns answered with a brutal certainty. The Brownings came alive in deep, pounding bursts, the recoil driving through tripods into the soaked earth, the belts feeding through gloved hands as if pulled by force. Tracers stitched red lines into the darkness, briefly sketching human outlines in the open. Helmets, shoulders, the sudden stumble of a man hit, and the chain reaction as bodies behind him collided and fell. At this range, there was no comfortable distance, no time for second thoughts, only the instinctive discipline of shifting fire by inches and degrees to keep the corridor sealed. Japanese troops pressed in tight groups, some trying to sprint through the beaten zone, others dropping low and crawling, searching for dead ground that did not exist under overlapping arcs. Within minutes, the assault in front of Basilon's section began to break apart under the concentrated fire. The 9th Company of the Japanese 3rd Battalion was cut down so quickly it ceased to function as a coherent unit, its survivors scattering into the mud among the fallen. But the attack did not slow, because the next wave was already stepping over the first, driven forward by momentum, orders, and the hard logic that Henderson Field had to be reached. The night became a strobing sequence of flashes and shadows. Grenades flared and vanished. Rifles barked from the tree line. The Marines' faces appeared for an instant in the gunlight, tight jaws, rainwater streaming off noses and chin straps, then disappeared again into darkness. Across the corridor, Japanese faces surfaced in the same harsh illumination, some set and determined, others widened by shock as they ran into a wall of fire they could not see until it was already tearing through them. The volume of shooting built until it felt continuous, a single sustained presence that drowned out everything else. The machine gun barrels began to glow faintly in the rain, a dull red that looked unreal against the black jungle, steam hissing where water struck hot metal. Men shouted for ammunition, for barrel changes, for targets moving left, targets moving right, while Basilone kept the guns talking, keeping the fire disciplined, keeping the corridor closed, knowing that the battle was not about the bodies in front of them but about the ground behind them. The airfield, the planes, the fragile hold of the Marines on an island that wanted them gone. By 200, the night over Guadalcanal had lost whatever structure it had started with and become a single, grinding test of endurance measured in bursts of gunfire and the intervals between them. The rain still fell, less a storm now than a steady, insistent presence that turned every movement into an effort and every weapon into something that had to be coaxed, not just used. The ground around Basilone's positions had long since surrendered to the water. The gun pits were half mud, half standing pools, the edges collapsing inward every time a man shifted his weight. Empty shell casings sank into the muck and disappeared under fresh layers of churned earth and blood. The air, even in the open, felt close and hot around the guns, charged with the metallic tang of spent rounds and the sour, human smell of sweat and fear. The corridor in front of the Marine line looked less like terrain and more like the aftermath of some violent, unplanned reshaping of the earth. Bodies, broken equipment, torn foliage all mashed together into a landscape that had not existed a few hours before. Yet the one constant in that chaos was the knowledge that, for all the damage already done, the night was far from over. The pressure on the line had been steady, then growing, then relentless. Wave after wave had driven into the fields of fire, leaving the 9th Company of the Japanese 3rd Battalion torn apart in front of Basilone's guns. But those bodies were not acting as a barrier. They were becoming cover for the men who followed, shallow mounds and depressions to duck behind, pockets of concealment in a space the Marines had hoped to turn into pure open ground. The enemy's determination to reach Henderson Field was not theoretical. It was visible in each attempt to probe along the edges of the killing zone, in each small group trying to feel out a weakness left or right of the main corridor. Artillery and mortars, which had started the night as punctuation, now fell with more regularity, bracketing suspected strongpoints, searching for places where the Marines might be clustered. The explosions were close enough too often. Shrapnel scythed through the flimsy overhead cover, tore into sandbags, and slapped across helmets with vicious, glancing force. Every blast threw more water and dirt into the air, briefly adding a curtain of flying debris to a world already obscured by darkness and rain. In one of Basilone's gun pits, the balance finally tipped. A string of mortar rounds, walked in by a Japanese observer who had found the range, fell with frightening precision along the line. One burst landed almost on top of the position, showering it with splinters of steel and choking clouds of earth. The gun crew, already exhausted from hours of firing, disappeared in a spray of mud and smoke. When the dust settled enough for shapes to re-emerge, only 2 men were able to move at all, and even they were shaken, ears ringing, faces pale beneath the grime. Their comrades lay broken around the Browning, some still, some making only small, involuntary motions. The heavy machine gun itself had been knocked sideways, tripod legs splayed awkwardly in the mud, the water jacket dented, barrel caked. For a few seconds that seemed to stretch, the lane covered by that weapon fell silent, an absence of noise that stood out sharply against the continuing roar just meters away. In those same moments, the limitations of even a well-prepared defense became brutally clear. Ammunition belts, which had looked plentiful at the start of the night, were vanishing faster than anyone had planned for. The rate of fire needed to keep the corridor sealed was burning through reserves at a pace that felt unsustainable. Men who had been feeding the guns for hours were now working on instinct, their hands moving to boxes that suddenly felt light, their fingers finding the last coils of linked rounds in places that had been full. Habit made them move as if more would always be there. Awareness crept in only when their hands closed on emptiness. Calls went up for more belts, shouted over the din, carried along the line by runners and echoed in other pits. The responses that came back were not reassuring. Supplies were still there, but the margin for error was narrowing with every burst. The strain on the weapons themselves added another layer of crisis. The second machine gun section, which had been pouring out fire without pause, started to falter as the mechanical reality of sustained combat asserted itself. Barrels that had been swapped once, twice, now ran hot again within minutes. In the dark and the wet, with hands numb and clumsy from cold and fatigue, the men struggled to clear jams that seemed to multiply. A failure to feed here, a ruptured cartridge case there. Each malfunction stole seconds that the enemy tried to use. Gunners cursed under their breath, working the charging handles, slamming covers shut, tapping the receivers as if willing the steel to cooperate. The guns still spoke, but not with the easy, continuous rhythm they had maintained earlier in the night. Hesitations crept into the line like skipped heartbeats. The Japanese sensed these rhythms too. Where the fire stuttered, their infantry pressed harder. On the perimeter's left flank, just beyond Basilone's immediate control, they found a shallow draw and used it like a knife, slipping men through in 2s and 3s, then in larger groups. The jungle there offered a bit more cover, a few more trees still standing, a few more folds in the ground, and the attackers exploited each advantage without hesitation. They did not need to break the line everywhere. They needed to bend it somewhere to pry open a crack that would let them pour men behind the guns aimed forward. Soon, scattered reports came back of enemy soldiers appearing behind Marine positions, firing from unexpected angles, tossing grenades from the rear. The defense, which had been oriented firmly toward the front, now had to contend with threats from directions that had been assumed secure. For the men in the corridor, this shift changed the feel of the fight more than any single explosion. A position that had once felt linear, with a clear sense of where the enemy was, became more like a circle that might be tightening around them. In one pit, a loader felt the unmistakable snap of a round passing close behind him, the bullet whacking into the back wall instead of the front. In another, a Marine turned at the sound of Japanese, shouting from the trees at his flank, and saw figures moving where none should have been. The realization that the enemy was not just in front, but also to the side and behind did not produce panic so much as a cold, heavy awareness. The perimeter was no longer a firm line. It was a shape under attack in multiple places at once, and the margin between holding and being overwhelmed had thinned to something almost intangible. Basilone read that change not from a map, but from the sounds and fragments of messages reaching him through the storm. A runner stumbled into his position, panting, relaying word of the knocked-out gun and the thinning belts. Another voice called from the neighboring section about increased fire from the left. He could see for himself the sputtering of one of his Brownings, the momentary pauses as the crew wrestled with another jam. The defensive corridor he had worked so carefully to structure earlier now felt as if it were twisting under pressure, its interlocking fields of fire at risk of unraveling if even one key point failed. Standing where he was, he could keep one gun group effective, or he could move to shore up the other. What he could not do, no matter how strong his will, was occupy both spaces at once. Decision in that moment was not an abstract quality but a physical act. Basilone weighed the reports, glanced down the line, and understood that waiting to see how events played out would only let the enemy write the next page for him. The corridor was narrow in geography but vast in consequence. If it collapsed here, there would be precious little time for anyone behind to improvise. He could feel his own exhaustion and the heaviness of his limbs, the way his legs protested each movement, but it mattered less than the simple arithmetic of guns to ground. He had men who needed a leader at the crippled position, a weapon that had to be brought back into action if the line was to stay intact. Staying where he was would mean watching the situation deteriorate in the name of control. Moving meant stepping into the open, into a space where every tracer line seemed to intersect. He looked once more at the men around him, then chose the only option that offered any chance of keeping that corridor from folding in on itself. He would go to the failing point and try to drag it back into the fight, one man carrying the weight of a position that could not be allowed to die in the mud. When the gun went silent, the absence of its voice cut through the night more sharply than any explosion had. The corridor that Basilone had spent the day shaping with overlapping fields of fire suddenly had a gap in it, a place where the darkness in front of the Marines no longer sparked and flared with the heavy, steady rhythm of the Browning. He did not need a report to know what that meant. The jagged sequence of blasts that had walked in along the line, the last one landing almost on top of that position, had been enough to tell him something had gone very wrong there. Men were down. The weapon that anchored that slice of ground was out of the fight. In the few heartbeats after the blast, enemy fire felt thicker along that stretch, as if the Japanese could sense the weakness and were pouring men and shots toward it in the hope of widening it into a breach. The thought of watching that happen from his current pit, of trying to direct others to fix a problem they could barely see, was intolerable. The choice resolved itself into movement. The machine gun lay where it had been thrown by the blast, half buried in mud, its tripod twisted, the water jacket dented. The men who had served it were sprawled around it in positions no living body took. When Basilone reached them, lungs burning from the sprint, boots slapping through the waterlogged ground, he had only seconds to register the scene. The shattered emplacement, the fragments of torn sandbags, the churned earth marked by shrapnel. He did not stop to catalog faces. There would be time later if he lived long enough to reckon with who had been lost. Right now, the gun was what mattered. Weighing close to 90 pounds with its mount and jacket, it was never meant to be treated like a rifle, but he bent, gripped it, and lifted, muscles straining as the slick metal tried to twist in his hands. For a moment, the weight threatened to pull him backward, but his legs, hardened by months of hauling gear through island mud, held. Then he was running. The 200 yards between his section and the silenced pit felt far longer than they looked on any map. Out in that open stretch, the relative protection of parapets and holes vanished. The ground rolled in uneven swells, broken by stumps, shell holes, and the bodies of men who had fallen earlier in the night. Japanese fire, which had been probing, now clawed at this exposed figure carrying a weapon that by its very silhouette marked him as a priority target. Tracer rounds cut across his path, red and green streaks that seemed to reach for his chest and legs. Basilone moved in a low, driving run, not sprinting wildly but pushing at a pace he could sustain, muscles locked into a rhythm that ignored the burning in his lungs. The mud grabbed at his boots, the gun dragged at his shoulders, but he held onto it because there was nothing else to hold onto. The noise around him, rifles snapping, machine guns hammering, mortars thumping in the near distance, flattened into a single roar through which he traced a line toward the damaged position. When he dropped into the wrecked pit, the sudden nearness of the enemy was jarring. Japanese soldiers were close, too close, moving in low, dark shapes along the edges of the line, some trying to crawl into positions that would give them a clear angle to throw grenades or fire directly into the holes. Basilone did not have the luxury of setting up the Browning first. His .45 was in his hand almost without conscious thought, the heavy pistol bucking in sharp, controlled shots as he fired at figures glimpsed between bursts of light and drifting smoke. The distance was short enough that details stood out even in the chaos. A helmet knocked sideways on a man's head, a hand reaching for a grenade, the sudden arch of a body hit center mass. Each round bought seconds, bought a little more space around the hole he needed to revive. Then came the work on the gun itself. He wrestled it into position, driving the tripod's legs down into the mucky floor of the pit, trying to find a patch of ground firm enough to keep it from sliding under recoil. His fingers, slick with mud and sweat, fumbled for the receiver, for the feed cover, for the familiar shapes of the parts he had stripped and assembled countless times in training and combat. The water jacket's dent worried him, but there was no time to test for leaks. He grabbed a belt, snapped it into place, pulled back the charging handle. The Browning's first burst was ragged, the weapon coughing out rounds as if waking from a hard blow, but then it steadied. Its voice rejoined the chorus along the line, and the corridor's geometry of fire was whole again, at least for the moment. As he hosed down the ground in front of the position, cutting into the clusters of enemy infantry trying to exploit the earlier silence, another reality began to press in. The ammunition piled near this gun was nearly gone. The few belts he had been able to bring him were vanishing in short, deliberate bursts. Boxes that had once felt solid under the hand proved light when lifted. Across the line, others were shouting for more ammo, signaling the same invisible drain. The enemy's pressure had severed the usual paths for resupply. The spaces between pits that runners used to move along were now under intermittent small arms fire, and in some spots Japanese infiltrators had slipped in close enough to make any kind of movement a gamble. The arsenal that had allowed the Marines to turn that corridor into a killing ground was being eaten away each second. The guns did their work. Standing in the pit, feeling the heat radiate from the barrel even through the rain, Basilone understood that keeping the gun alive without feeding it was useless. He could stay and fire until the last belt ran dry, turning a functional weapon into a worthless lump of metal at the precise moment when it needed to be strongest. Or he could try to reopen the flow of ammunition himself. The idea of leaving the pit he had just fought to reestablish, of stepping back into the same exposed ground he had just crossed, went against every instinct of self-preservation, but instinct did not matter as much as calculation. The ammunition dump lay behind the line, a place that under normal circumstances would have been within relatively safe reach. Now, with portions of the perimeter bowed and enemy soldiers filtering through low points, that rear area was threaded with danger. He made the decision quickly, the way he had made the first one. He handed the firing line over to those still able to shoot, gave them a brief, clear instruction on conserving what remained, then climbed out of the pit. The journey back toward the dump was more complicated than the trip forward. Japanese fire now came from angles that did not match the neat, front-facing diagrams in tactical manuals. He had to move in a jagged pattern, cutting from one shallow depression to another, using the shadows of shattered trees and the contours of shell craters as makeshift cover. In places, he dropped flat as rounds snapped overhead, the earth jumping under the impact of bullets that missed by inches. In others, he rose and ran, timing his dashes with the rhythm of friendly fire so as not to cross another gun's line of sight. At the ammunition point, he did not pause to explain. Men there were already working furiously, sorting belts, boxing and unboxing rounds, trying to keep track of requests coming in from every direction. He seized as much as he could physically carry, belts draped over shoulders, boxes hugged against his chest, feeling the combined weight dig into his back and bite into his hands. The journey forward, back toward the line, back across the same 200 yards of contested ground, was a test of brutality more than courage. Every step sent shocks of pain through his feet and up tired legs. The straps and edges of the ammunition cut into his palms until blisters raised and tore, leaving the skin raw and slick. The rain plastered his uniform to his body, each movement dragging wet cloth across chafed skin, adding small torments to larger ones. Yet he did not slow. The knowledge of what waited at the other end of that passage, the gun needing its lifeblood, the men depending on its voice to keep the enemy from opening that corridor to Henderson, pushed him through each patch of fire, each patch of sucking mud. He moved like a man carrying not just steel and powder, but the thin, fragile margin by which a line holds instead of buckles. When he dropped back into the pit once more, hands burning, arms trembling from exertion, the relief was not personal. It was the relief of continuity, of a system kept alive against odds that, on paper, should have erased it. The belts he dragged in were fed into the hungry machine without ceremony. The Browning's bolt slid forward, and once again the gun began to speak into the dark, each round a small assertion that the corridor was not yet lost, that as long as men like Basilone could still move, still lift, still carry, the ground around Henderson Field would remain in American hands a little longer. The hours before dawn did not feel like time passing so much as a long compression of effort, each minute pressed tight against the next by the constant necessity of keeping the corridor sealed. Basilone moved between the gun pits with the same stubborn rhythm he had used on his runs for ammunition, stepping into positions only long enough to fix what was failing, to replace what had been lost, to keep the weapons speaking into the rain. When a Browning jammed from heat and grit, he leaned into it with hands already raw, forcing the feed cover open, tearing at swollen cartridges, working the mechanism until the bolt finally cycled clean again. When a loader went down and a belt slipped into the mud, he dragged it free, wiped what he could with a filthy sleeve, and fed it back in because their W. As no such thing as clean ammunition anymore, only ammunition that still fired. He shouted directions that were short and practical, where to shift fire, where the silhouettes were building, which lane could not be allowed to go quiet. And then he was moving again, hunched low as rounds snapped and hissed around him. As the fight dragged on, the enemy's intent remained clear even as their cohesion began to fracture. Small groups still tried to rush, still tried to crawl into dead ground, still tried to slip along the edges where the line bent, but the earlier sense of a single coordinated assault gave way to desperate, localized pushes. In the brief flashes of muzzle light, Basilone saw faces that looked less like an unstoppable force and more like men driven to keep going because stopping meant something worse. Some Japanese soldiers fired wildly from the hip, others threw grenades with the last of their strength. Some simply kept moving forward into fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The rain had soaked them as thoroughly as it had soaked the Marines, and the mud made every step cost more than it should have. Still, they came, and the corridor stayed dangerous, a place where a few seconds of silence could become a doorway. A second gun position faltered when its mechanism seized, and the crew's hands shook too much to clear it. Basilone slid into the pit, pushed exhausted men aside without cruelty, and worked the gun himself, shoulders braced, cheek pressed against wet metal. The barrel glowed faintly even in the rain, an ugly red that spoke of hours of punishment, and steam hissed off it as if the weapon were alive. When he finally got it firing again, he held it alone for a stretch, firing in controlled bursts that cut down movement in the lane until replacements, men pulled from elsewhere on the line, arrived to take over. He did not linger to accept thanks. He moved back toward the other position where the sound of firing had thinned, and where thinning sound meant danger. By the time the sky began to pale, ammunition had become a scarce, brutal arithmetic. Belts ran down to the last coils. Boxes were lifted and found empty. The firing that remained had to be measured, aimed, rationed. In the half-light before dawn, Bazilone's world narrowed further, not to what he wanted to do, but to what was possible with what remained. When the last belt finally went slack and the gun clicked empty, he did not freeze. He drew his .45 and fired into shapes that surged too close for comfort. And when even that became a matter of distance and desperation, he gripped a machete, less a weapon than a tool pressed into service, and stood in the mud at the edge of the pit like a man refusing to be moved. The final Japanese attempts were violent but less coordinated, the kind of last effort that spends itself quickly when it meets organized resistance instead of a collapsing line. At roughly 600, the attacks began to ebb in a way that was unmistakable. The shouting thinned. The movement in front of the corridor slowed, then broke apart into scattered figures retreating or lying still. Reinforcements pushed forward into the battered positions as daylight strengthened, stepping carefully over churned ground and twisted bodies. Bazilone, soaked through and streaked with mud and cordite, settled at the edge of his gun pit in a posture that looked almost casual until you saw how his hands trembled when they finally had nothing to hold. Around him, the evidence of the night lay in harsh daylight. Nearly 100 enemy dead in the immediate vicinity, the corridor transformed into a graveyard of failed momentum. Later counts and official reports would attribute at least 38 of the dead directly to Bazilone's fire and actions during the defense, and the larger Japanese assault, elements of a regiment thrown against the perimeter, had been shattered in front of Henderson Field. In the days after the night assault, Guadalcanal looked different, even though nothing on a map had changed. The jungle still pressed in on the cleared ground around Henderson Field, the airstrip still ran like a pale scar through the dark soil, and the same humid, heavy air clung to every surface. But when Marines walked the perimeter in daylight, rifles slung and steps slowed by fatigue, they moved through a landscape that made the cost of holding that thin line unmistakable. Bodies lay thick in front of the American positions, many contorted where they had fallen under the overlapping streams of machine gun fire. Men counted almost without meaning to, lips moving silently as they stepped between shattered equipment and torn uniforms, the numbers climbing past hundreds and into a total that would eventually be recorded as more than 1,400 Japanese dead scattered along the division's front. In front of Bazilone's section, the concentration was particularly dense. The corridor that had been chosen as the most direct route to Henderson Field, the only practical avenue through which an attacking force could have driven straight at the airstrip, was now a testament to how close the enemy had come and how firmly they had been stopped. The awareness of what had been prevented took time to sink in. For the men who had fired until their barrels glowed and their hands bled, the first sensation was not triumph but exhaustion. They slept where they could, propped against the still damp walls of their pits, or on the bare ground behind the line, helmets tilted over eyes to block the bright island sun. When they woke, they helped with the work that followed every major fight, policing the battlefield, tending to the wounded, burying their own dead. Graves detail parties moved with quiet efficiency, marking and recording hastily dug resting places for Marines who would later be reinterred. At the same time, teams pushed out cautiously into the ground that had been contested hours before, checking for wounded Japanese who might still resist, collecting documents, inspecting weapons abandoned in the rush and confusion of withdrawal. It was in these deliberate sweeps that the true scale of the assault against the junction held by Bazilone's section became clear to officers walking the line, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning the traces of an enemy plan that had come close to doing what it was designed to do. Reports began to move upward through the chain of command in the way they always did, but the accounts that mentioned Bazilone had a particular clarity. Multiple witnesses described him moving between positions throughout the night, repairing guns, carrying ammunition, and at times manning weapons alone under direct fire. They noted the distances he covered across ground swept by bullets and mortar fragments, the way he continued to fight even when supplies ran low, and the effect his actions had on keeping the critical stretch of the perimeter intact. Those details, written and rewritten in different hands, gathered weight as they traveled from company to battalion, from regiment to division. What had started as a series of impressions, Bazilone kept us in business. One man might say, took form as a narrative of conduct that fit the highest categories of valor recognized by the Corps. The language, once it reached the desks of senior commanders, became formal and measured, but it carried within it the raw, practical respect of the men who had watched him work through that night. 3 months later, John Bazilone stood not in a muddy pit under a Pacific downpour, but in a more controlled setting where uniforms were clean, boots polished, and the weight in the air came from ceremony rather than imminent violence. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States could bestow, for his actions on Guadalcanal. The citation spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, phrases that tried to compress hours of chaos, fear, and decision into a form that could be read to a gathered audience. Afterward, he did what many recipients at that time were asked to do. He went home, not to rest in anonymity, but to serve as a symbol. On war bond tour across the United States, he stood before crowds who saw in him a distilled version of the struggle in distant waters and jungles. He helped raise more than $1 million, his presence lending weight to posters and speeches, his quiet manner contrasting with the dramatic headlines that often framed his story. Yet for Bazilone, the attention sat uneasily. He had come from the line, from the mud and noise, and the idea of being set apart from other Marines, turned into an emblem, did not fit his sense of himself. Accounts from those who knew him describe a man who repeatedly asked to return to a combat unit, who said he would rather be a plain Marine than a figurehead permanently removed from. The risk shared by his friends. In time, his request was granted. Bazilone trained with new units, preparing for another Pacific landing that planners expected to be among the most brutal of the war. In February 1945, he came ashore on the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima as a gunnery sergeant, leading his platoon forward under conditions that rivaled, and in some ways exceeded, the intensity he had known on Guadalcanal. Japanese defenses on the island were deeply prepared, layered in tunnels, caves, and mutually supporting positions. The beach itself was a killing zone, its loose ash-like sand slowing movement and offering little cover. Under heavy mortar and artillery fire, Bazilone did what he had always done. He moved toward the point of greatest need, directing Marines through the chaos, helping destroy an enemy blockhouse with a grenade and demolitions, and urging his men off the exposed shoreline toward the marginal safety of higher ground. It was in the midst of this work that an artillery shell found him, killing him instantly. He was 27 years old. The weight of survival in his story does not rest only in the fact that he lived through Guadalcanal and died on Iwo Jima. It also lies in what his actions allowed others to survive and to do. The line he held in front of Henderson Field kept the airstrip in American hands at a moment when its loss might have altered the course of the campaign. The men whose lives intersected with his on that island carried forward their own memories, their own accounts, adding threads to the larger fabric of how the war in the Pacific would be remembered. After his death, Basilone was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, his grave one among thousands of white stones that mark individual stories folded into a national narrative. His name has been given to ships and streets, to memorials in hometowns far from the jungles and beaches where he fought. Yet the core of his legacy remains grounded in that single night on Guadalcanal, in the specific, physical acts of lifting a gun, carrying ammunition, clearing jams, and refusing to yield a narrow corridor of ground because beyond it lay an airfield. And beyond that, a larger war that demanded in those hours everything he had to give.